So welcome everyone, or welcome again, and it's our great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who is Professor Melissa Moschella, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at CUA, and her research focuses on, among other things, on bioethical issues, including reproductive ethics. Professor Moschella is the author of To Whom Do Children Belong, published by Cambridge University Press. Professor Moschella will be talking to us on sexual expressionism, reproductive technologies, and the objectification of women and children. So over to you, Melissa.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thanks so much for the invitation. So this talk originally kind of started as a talk I was asked to give for a student group, and then I kind of built on that and decided to try to connect some of these concepts in more depth. So here it goes. I'll basically just kind of read through the paper, and then welcome any questions or comments, criticisms, suggestions, and so on. So what do the culture of sexual expressionism and reproductive technologies have in common? At first glance, they seem to be in tension with one another. Sexual expressionism sees our capacity for procreation as the enemy and relies on hormonal birth control and abortion to free sex from its connection to children, while reproductive technologies go to great lengths to enable people to have children without sex. Yet, I will argue that they are actually both fruits of the same tree, reflections of a culture that treats women's and unborn children's bodies, and particularly women's fertility, as objects of technical manipulation and control. Our culture presumes that we can and should have complete control over our reproductive and sexual capacities by manipulating those capacities to suit our desires. This presumption, in turn, rests on a failure to recognize and respect the dignity of the body, and especially the bodies of women and unborn children, as essential and intrinsic to our personhood, rather than as machines to be manipulated and controlled at will. In this presentation, I will analyze and explain how this underlying cultural objectification of women's and children's bodies is manifest in the widespread use of hormonal birth control, with abortion as a backup, to ensure sexual freedom, and in the practice of IVF as the standard medical response to infertility. I will contrast these objectifying approaches to sexuality and procreation with fertility awareness-based methods that help couples to prevent or achieve pregnancy by understanding, respecting, and when necessary, healing the body, rather than manipulating or bypassing the woman's natural reproductive capacities to achieve a desired result. Finally, I will conclude the presentation with some reflections on how our culture's attitudes towards sexuality and procreation contrast with a vocational vision of sexuality and of human life more generally. So first, let's consider the key tenets of the sexual expressionism that dominates our culture. Sexual expressionism, a term that I take from the work of Helen Alvarez, holds that the freedom of consenting adults to express themselves sexually in whatever way they prefer is a fundamental human right, a core element of personal identity and dignity. Crucial to this view is the assumption that the right to sexual expression requires the ability to engage in sexual activity without any responsibility for the natural consequences of such activity, namely children. Sexual expressionism attempts to sever not only the inherent connection between sex and procreation, but also the inherent connection between sex and marriage. On this view, sex could be a way of expressing love and commitment, or of seeking to have a child, if that's what you happen to want. But it need not involve any of these things if you don't want it to. Philosopher Igor Primoratz exemplifies this view in his claim that there is no inherent meaning or purpose to sex beyond the attainment of sexual pleasure, and thus that there are no special moral norms governing sexual activity. Of course, the pesky biological fact remains that sexual intercourse is the first stage in the process of human reproduction. And so the sexual expressionist culture must do everything it can to alter this biological reality and hide it from consciousness. Thus, the right to worry-free recreational sex is made possible by hormonal birth control, with abortion available as a backup when birth control fails. Necessary since the only 100% effective method of birth control is abstinence. As the Guttmacher Institute, Planned Parenthood's research arm, reports, 40% of women seeking abortions were using some method of contraception when they got pregnant. Justice O'Connor explicitly noted the contraception-abortion connection in the United States Supreme Court's Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision upholding the Roe versus Wade decision that had legalized abortion across the country. O'Connor wrote, for 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail, unquote. Note as well here the court's claim that people's ability to express themselves sexually without fear of the consequences is considered central to one's identity, a key element in the argument that sexual expression is a fundamental right. In other words, the introduction of hormonal birth control and its widespread use is connected to the claim that sexual expression is at the core of our identity, and that living out this identity and finding fulfillment in life requires manipulating our bodies, particularly women's bodies, in order to be able to have sex whenever we desire, while only taking on the responsibility of parenthood when or if we happen to want to. We manipulate women's bodies by altering them hormonally in ways that many doctors, including some who have no moral objections to birth control or abortion, are now recognizing to be harmful to women's physical and psychological health in both the short term and the long term. And when the woman's body manages to do what it's designed to do, despite our best efforts to manipulate it, it's presumed that we then have a right to avoid taking responsibility for the resulting child by killing it before it's born, also doing violence to the woman's body and risking her physical and psychological health in the process. It's worth noting here that the burden of achieving control of our reproductive capacities in this way falls almost entirely on women. While there have been and continue to be attempts to make a male birth control pill, so far the trials have always been stopped because of the side effects like acne, mood swings, and decreased sex drive that women on the pill have been putting up with for decades. By contrast, early versions of the female birth control pill had lethal side effects for some women. One woman died in early clinical trials and others as the drug was rolled out, but trials continued and more women died after the pill was made widely available. While newer versions of the pill are safer, it still increases the risk of blood clots, and high estrogen versions of the pill are labeled group 1 carcinogens by the World Health Organization. But this risk is deemed acceptable because there is said to be a direct health benefit to the woman. As one article puts it, women taking some versions of the pill increase their risk of conditions such as blood clots, but this is balanced by the risk that pregnancy would present to their health. Note that pregnancy, that is a healthy function of the woman's reproductive system, is treated in this article as if it were a disease. By contrast, the article says that even relatively mild side effects of male birth control have been deemed unacceptable because there is no direct health benefit to men. In other words, since only women can get pregnant, they're the ones who are burdened with the results of unprotected sex, and they're the ones who should be burdened with the side effects of hormones to control their fertility. So much for calling on men to bear their fair share of reproductive responsibility, despite the fact that it tends to be men more than women who desire to engage in uncommitted sexual encounters. As Leah Fessler points out in an insightful article on the hookup culture at Middlebury College, for women, sex is usually, not always, but usually much more about emotional connection than mere physical pleasure. Fessler found that sexual encounters outside of committed relationships were dehumanizing and often not even pleasant for women, who are much less likely than men to even achieve sexual climax outside of a committed relationship. Writing about her own experiences and that of her friends, Fessler comments, quote, "My girlfriends and I were top students, scientists, artists, and leaders. We could advocate for anything except our own bodies. We won accolades from our professors, but the men we were sleeping with wouldn't even eat breakfast with us the next morning, unquote. She and her friends, she says, quote, were desperate to know what it felt like to be wanted, desperate for a chance at intimacy, unquote. The men with whom they were hooking up, however, seemed not to care. Months after they had stopped hooking up, one of the men even told Leah, quote, I didn't think of you as a human being while we were hooking up, unquote. If that's not an indication of the way in which sex without commitment dehumanizes women and objectifies their bodies, I'm not sure what is. This points to an important but often overlooked reality that Erica Bacchiacchi calls sexual asymmetry. In other words, the risks of uncommitted sex are asymmetrical. For women, those risks are very high, whereas for men, the risks are relatively low. Conversely, while ultimately I believe that neither men nor women actually benefit from uncommitted sexual encounters, indeed the research of Fessler and others indicates that neither men nor women are happy with the hookup culture. Nonetheless, the benefits from these encounters, at least in terms of sexual pleasure, are much higher for men on average than for women, and the risks to them, physically and psychologically, are much lower. Hormonal birth control and legalized abortion as a backup contraceptive make women more sexually available to men, also depriving them of the excuses that they used to be able to give to say no when being pressured into sex by their boyfriends. And they basically make women bear the whole burden of that sexual availability. And since abortion is the woman's choice, the man also feels more readily absolved of any responsibility to support the child if she decides not to abort. She's the one who has to deal with the side effects of birth control. She's the one who has to make the heart-wrenching decision of whether or not to abort if birth control fails. And she's the one who has to either deal with the physical and psychological consequences of abortion or with the responsibilities of parenthood. The asymmetry here is unavoidable because it's based on unalterable biological differences between men and women. But instead of calling on men to take full responsibility for the consequences of their actions and to control their sexual desires until they are ready to do so, society tries to mask this asymmetry through manipulation of women's bodies. But technical manipulation of women's bodies doesn't change the fact that women are simply more vulnerable to the effects of uncommitted sex, both physically and emotionally. Instead, it just places new and even more onerous burdens on women to manipulate their bodies and eliminates the cultural pressures that in the past had pushed men to be more responsible. In addition to manipulating women's reproductive and sexual capacities so that it's possible, at least for men, to have uncommitted sex without bearing the associated burdens or risks, the cultural sexual expressionism also treats a woman's fertility as something extrinsic to her overall personal reality, as if fertility were a machine that could be turned off when children are not wanted and then turned on again to produce a child in short order whenever one is desired. The reality, however, is that a woman's fertility is not a machine that can be turned off and on without consequences. Many women find that when they do finally want to become pregnant, being on the pill for years has masked or caused problems with their cycle that make it difficult for them to conceive or sustain a pregnancy. And when this happens, rather than trying to understand and treat the underlying problems contributing to infertility, the standard medical approach generally settles for a relatively superficial investigation of the cause, and then quickly recommends another technological workaround in which the woman's body is manipulated yet again in ways that involve serious health risks for both woman and child in order to conceive via in vitro fertilization. IVF involves a number of health risks for women, including the risks of hyperstimulation of the ovaries to produce multiple eggs that are then harvested for fertilization outside the body. And the process instrumentalizes her body for its reproductive capacity, performing interventions that don't actually aim to restore her health, but rather manipulate her body or another woman's body, in the case when an egg donor is used, in order to get the raw materials necessary to produce a child, and then manipulate her or another woman's body to make it gestate that child. The failure to respect the dignity of the child in IVF is even more stark than the failure to respect the dignity of the woman. children conceived through IVF are subjected to the logic of manufacture and production, in which efficiency and customer satisfaction are the paramount values. For the sake of efficiency, for instance, IVF is usually done in a way that attempts to produce multiple embryos at once. Those embryos are then subjected to quality control screening, in which embryologists rank the embryos according to a grading system, selecting the healthiest for transfer to the woman's uterus, discarding low-quality embryos, and cryopreserving any additional high-quality embryos. The fate of these frozen embryos, of which there are estimated to be over 1 million in the US alone, is uncertain. Most remain in cryostorage indefinitely. The quality control element of the IVF process is intensified when genetic testing is done on the embryos, making it possible to select embryos on the basis of the presence or absence of certain traits or diseases. While IVF could be done using only 1 or 2 eggs per cycle and transferring all embryos produced to the uterus, thus avoiding the problem of what to do with excess embryos and minimizing the eugenic quality control aspect of the process, as well as lowering the risk to the woman, the logic of efficiency almost always trumps these considerations about respecting the value of embryonic human life and the dignity of the woman's body. This attitude toward the child as a product of manufacture to satisfy the desires of the would-be parent or parents is also seen in the practice of selective reduction. Sometimes when an unwanted multiple fetus pregnancy occurs, often because more than 1 embryo was transferred to the uterus in order to increase the likelihood of success, 1 or more of the excess fetuses are aborted in order to avoid the risks and complications of a multiple pregnancy, or simply because the parents don't want that many children. A 2011 New York Times article discussing this practice presents the story of a woman named Jenny, who became pregnant with twins as a result of IVF and chose to abort one of them. Jenny's reflections on her decision powerfully reveal how IVF rests on an attitude toward children as products of manufacture, made to satisfy the desires of the adults who commissioned their creation. And here I quote Jenny's reflections on her decision to reduce the pregnancy. Jenny says, "If I had conceived these twins naturally, I wouldn't have reduced this pregnancy, because you feel like if there's a natural order, then you don't want to disturb it. But we created this child in such an artificial manner, in a test tube, choosing an egg donor, having the embryo placed in me. And somehow, making a decision about how many to carry seemed to be just another choice. The pregnancy was all so consumerish to begin with, and this became yet another thing we could control." Let me reiterate that last line. This became yet another thing we could control. I think this line captures the core of the prevalent cultural attitudes surrounding human sexuality and procreation, which is the presumption that we can and should have complete control over our reproductive and sexual capacities by manipulating those capacities to suit our preferences and desires. And this can only be done by treating the human body, particularly the bodies of women and of nascent human beings, as an object of technical manipulation, rather than as an essential aspect of the human person that deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. There is, however, an alternative approach to sexuality that respects the dignity of the body as an intrinsic aspect of the human person, an approach that contrasts with sexual expressionism's claim that sex has no inherent meaning or purpose and need not involve anything beyond the consensual use of one's own or another's body to achieve sexual pleasure. This alternative approach, based on natural law and in accord with the Judeo-Christian tradition, recognizes that sex does have an inherent meaning, and that meaning is marriage, a uniquely all-encompassing union of persons inherently oriented toward procreation and family life. The ability to literally become one flesh with another human being by joining the two halves of the human reproductive system in sexual intercourse is the biological foundation of the marital community, a community that is different in kind and not just degree from all other forms of human community, insofar as it involves the unity of persons, not only at the level of mind and heart, but also at the level of body. And because this bodily unity is possible precisely only through the joining of the two halves of the reproductive system in an act that is the first stage in the process of reproduction, it is also the kind of community that is inherently oriented to procreation. Sexual intercourse is thus literally the embodiment of the marital community, the actualization and expression of the commitment a man and woman make to each other in their marriage vows. Engaging in sexual intercourse when there is no marital community to embody, therefore fails to respect the inherent meaning of one's bodily action and involves a kind of alienation from one's bodily self in which one treats the body as a sub-personal object for the achievement of pleasure in isolation from any genuine human good. It also involves a failure to respect the child that might result from one's sexual union, because it risks bringing a child into the world in the absence of a marital community that would enable the child to receive the united love and care of his or her parents within a stable family. Now, this alternative approach to sexuality that I've just described goes hand in hand with an alternative approach to fertility, one which recognizes the inherent connection between sex and procreation, and which calls for regulation of fertility or healing of infertility in ways that fully respect the bodies of women and children, precisely by respecting that inherent connection between sex and procreation. There are fertility awareness-based methods like NAPRO, natural procreative technologies, that can help couples either avoid or achieve pregnancy by understanding and working with the woman's body rather than manipulating it. Such approaches are gaining popularity even among those who disagree with the approach to sexuality that I just described, simply because it makes it possible to regulate one's fertility without shutting down one's cycle or taking health-disrupting hormones. Instead, one can avoid pregnancy by tracking one's cycle, noting the presence of certain biomarkers that indicate the approach of ovulation, and avoiding sexual activity within one's fertile window. Tracking one's cycle in this way, paired with other minor tests if needed, such as blood work to determine hormone levels throughout the cycle, or ultrasounds to monitor follicular development, also provides crucial information to help identify underlying causes of infertility in couples struggling to conceive or to sustain a pregnancy. Once these underlying causes are identified, many of them can be remedied. This approach is more effective than IVF, enabling 70% of infertile couples to have a child within a year, by contrast with IVF's 30% success rate. It heals the underlying causes of infertility, enabling couples to conceive naturally, and it respects the woman's body, actually promoting the woman's overall health, rather than manipulating the body and risking health to achieve a desired outcome. This general method of paying attention to the woman's cycle as a crucial indicator of overall health, rather than responding to women's health complaints by using the pill to mask problems, and sometimes in the end create or exacerbate them instead, is also starting to catch on broadly in the medical community, especially among more holistic medical practitioners. There are books out there now like Lara Bryden's Period Repair Manual and others that speak of a woman's cycle as a monthly report card on her overall health, or as a fifth vital sign that doctors ignore to the detriment of the health of their female patients. Yet, unfortunately, standard medical training tends to be woefully inadequate in this regard. One documentary on NAPRO shows a doctor explaining how after she had gone through all of medical school and residency as an OBGYN, she then attended a 1-hour introductory session on NAPRO technologies. And she says that she learned more in that 1-hour session about the woman's reproductive system than she did in her entire training in medical school and in residency. And the reason for that is that the standard kind of medical model tends to view women's fertility more as a quasi-disease to be manipulated and controlled than as an important aspect of women's health to be understood and respected. In sum, the widespread use of hormonal birth control with abortion as a backup to support the right to consequence-free sex and the manipulation of women's bodies and commodification of children through reproductive technologies to be able to have children on demand are both symptoms of the problematic cultural presumption that we can and should have complete control over our sexual capacities through technological manipulation. This cultural presumption is in stark contrast to what we might call a vocational vision of sexuality and of human life more broadly, a vision in which we're called to recognize that although we should make reasonable efforts to plan our lives, including our childbearing, responsibly, we need to do so in ways that respect the moral law, which protects the profound and intrinsic dignity of every human person understood as a unity of body and soul. This vocational vision, in line with the natural law and the Judeo-Christian tradition, calls us to respect our bodies and their procreative capacities, rather than treating them as sexual objects or reproductive machines. And it calls us to recognize that children are gifts to whom no one has the right, but rather who deserve our unconditional love and care, even when their arrival is unplanned. This vocational vision of life presumes that there is a God and that God's providence guides our lives, often in surprising and challenging ways that disrupt our own plans. Living with a vocational sense of life, which I believe is the ultimate antidote to a culture that objectifies women's and children's bodies, means always remaining open to God's surprises, as Pope Francis likes to put it. Indeed, many of the most meaningful and important things in our lives are things that come unbidden, surprises that God and his providence willed or allowed to occur. The great mystery and challenge of human sexuality is that it gives rise to what is perhaps the most wonderful and yet most terrifyingly life-altering and uncontrollable of God's surprises, namely children. This is perhaps the reason why our culture tries so hard to obscure and literally neuter that mystery of human sexuality. For in the end, it is not only or even primarily about mere sexual freedom, but is rather a matter of sustaining the illusion that we, rather than God, have ultimate sovereignty over human life. Thank you.